So, somebody asked me a question about the practical application of my work, and I thought it was worth answering because I've been talking a lot about practicality and the importance of getting practical, but I haven't really explained what I mean by that or what that looks like. So I'm going to answer this question, as I think the answer will benefit everybody. So the question is, do you use the connections you've been making in recent posts, hoping to see more practical ideas coming from here, or at least hear how you've used them? He adds after I responded, when the only thing provided is the symbolism, I'm left to guess the practical application looks like rituals of past magical systems, just using better, quote-unquote, realer symbols to get results. I'd understand if you really are breaking reality and how it would be stupid to post about that, but I'm still curious what you're actually doing and to what results. The only works mentioned were an I Was Dead and another from years ago. A lot of this just doesn't seem that far beyond chaos magic, and I'd really like it to be. Thanks for responding, at least you aren't a show-off. If I am anything, it's probably a show-off, but I appreciate you saying that. I do use them, but that use is usually very indirect. It doesn't look like use. In fact, it's rarely noticeable at all from outside, but sometimes it is. On October 1st, I was sitting in my room, and I was writing something, and then, suddenly, Zell instructed me to go to a specific intersection about 5 miles away. Now, this is the same place where I did my provocation of the Artifex about a year ago, and it's also the same place where I had the vision of the golden harp strings in Contact 2020. She told me to go there as fast as I possibly could, so I bolted out the door, and I drove there, and I parked exactly where she told me to. Just a short distance from where I parked, this object was lying in the grass near the road. This is a little booklet from the album Hemispheres by Rush. The centerpiece of the album is an 18-minute song about a world divided between Dionysus and Apollo, passion and reason. The protagonist of the story is an astronaut who, after falling into a black hole, becomes a cosmic mediator, ends this conflict, and is named Cygnus. In Greek myth, Cygnus was a close friend of Phaethon, who lamented his companion's death by the river Eridanus, and was transformed into a swan and then a constellation. If you haven't been following my work for very long, that might not mean very much, but if you've been here a while, you'll understand why this is so significant. It's very, very obviously signal. It's an encrypted little love letter, and if you can understand what's being communicated with this object, it's very obvious, particularly under the circumstances. If I were just taking a walk, and I happened to find this thing, that's not the same. It's the fact that Zell sent me to the thing's exact location that gives it such strong meaning. It's obviously an impressive example of the phenomenon that I've been talking about, and it would be very mysterious to most people, but if you understand how I model this activity, it makes perfect sense that this could happen, and it fits a larger pattern. It's actually very prototypical. If you go back and look at the story at the beginning of Holographic Platonism, this is just a bigger version of that. There's another very clear example at the beginning of Causal Curvature, another example given in Watchtower. The Resurrection Plan is another one. Even Contact 2020 and Theophany 2022, taken together, could serve as another example of the same phenomenon. And this is just pulling from the fraction of the things that I've made public. There are a lot of things that I can't share because I would have to dox myself or dox other people, or I would have to give too much background information for it to make sense. Explaining synchronicity is often like explaining a joke. It's like, if you have to explain, it's not going to land. Now, I already know what you're thinking. What's the practical utility of this? You still haven't demonstrated that there's any practical value. In order to answer, you need to understand what actually happened here. This is a very well demonstrated phenomenon at this point. It follows very consistent patterns which corroborate what I call the secret passage theory of constellation. I'll try to explain that. Think of your mind like a sheet of polarized glass. What you could call noumenal information can be imagined as unpolarized light, and as it crosses over into conscious awareness, it becomes polarized. We'll say horizontally polarized, but it doesn't matter. What that polarization represents in this analogy is the logic of the world in which the ego resides. The ego basically can only understand information that is horizontally polarized, that is like the other information it understands. It will reflexively reject information that doesn't seem to fit the patterns that it knows. So the anima or animus, which encompasses the ego and is the polarized glass in this analogy, screens out everything else. Because of this, the deepest part of the unconscious mind, which we know from Jung plays a compensatory or oppositional role, is polarized in the exact opposite way. And the reason for that opposite polarization is the fact that the unconscious mind is absorbing the information that's being screened out. So it's like you're filtering it, but you're filtering it by absorbing it. Because obviously it leaves some kind of impression upon the psyche. It just doesn't reach our awareness. So if the conscious mind has its own logical framework, the deep unconscious will essentially house the inverse of that. Now, there's no way to reverse engineer this. You can't derive the opposite of the logic of the conscious mind using the logic of the conscious mind. It's not going to work, and it would be stupid even if you could. Now, at the most basic level, if the conscious mind is working with the structure of forward causality, the unconscious will, just by negation, derive a description of the structure of retrocausality. Now, that will seem like a leap, and I'm going to say that to dispel the suspicion that I might not know. I know it sounds like a leap, but there are reasons that it's not. Part of the reason is that I can confidently assert that retrocausality, or something phenomenologically indistinguishable, exists, because I have mounds of observational evidence. I don't see it directly, but I see the end result of it. So these retrocausal processes must be moving through what I'm screening out. Retrocausal processes do not behave the same way as causal processes. It's not like normal causality in reverse. What moves quote-unquote forward and what moves quote-unquote backward are not the same thing. They're not governed by the same principles. Of course, much of this calls into question the entire idea of moving through time at all. The angel's pyramid, which I've discussed at length, is a cosmic structure. It's an image of reality, essentially. And if you understand the capstone as being the present moment fully zoomed out, and you understand that the entire structure is vertically isomorphic, then theoretically what that would mean is that at the base of the pyramid is an image which encodes all possible futures. And that's what the present moment is, and it contains all of them. In this view, as strange as it will sound, the future would actually already exist inside of the present, and the present would exist inside of the past. Every point at the base of the pyramid has a corresponding fiber connecting it to the apex. Each fiber is one potential timeline that branches off from the present moment. The entire volume of the pyramid can be seen as consisting of these fibers. Now, your state of consciousness would correspond to a position on the vertical axis of a microcosm of this pyramid. The more integrated the personality, the higher you go. The higher you go, the more potential futures you have access to from any given moment. This ascent would be experienced as an increase in psychic resolution. Your senses and thoughts would seem to get clearer. If your nervous system could get really, really good at scanning this field of potentiality, a task far too complicated for the ego alone, then theoretically, it would be able to target the best and narrowest pathways through time and space. Think about it like you're about to write an exam, and let's imagine your resolution is infinity, so you have a God's eye view in this thought experiment. That's not realistic, but it'll make things easy. At the top of the pyramid is the present. You've just sat down with the test booklet. From this vantage point, the totality of the mind can look quote-unquote down and perceive every single test you could possibly write being handed back to you from the present moment. At that level of resolution, you can cheat off your future self and guess your way to 100% without knowing how you did it. This is what Zell calls spinal tunneling, because you're tunneling through potentiality, and the spine seems to be crucially involved in making these calculations in real time, which is why I stress the importance of embodiment. If you're not very embodied, you won't be very in tune with those really, really deep systems, and if you're not in tune with those systems, you won't be able to coordinate with them. Now, from a chronodynamic perspective, what I just described would look like a string of extremely strange hunches, which altogether result in one hitting a very, very small target. In this model, the depiction of the teleological circuit from Causal Curvature would be a description of the phenomenology of constellation, but not the more fundamental reality. Anyways, all of this is theoretical. Regardless, there is good reason to suppose that the structure of what is experienced as the backwards transmission of information, or memory of the future, would be contained in the negation of the logic of the conscious world. This negation would be what I call the paralogical. Para means beside or contrary to, as in parallel and paradox. Logic means logic. I say paralogical rather than anti-logical because the latter seems to carry unhelpful connotations. We're not just flipping logic upside down. The paralogical doesn't make anti-sense, it makes a kind of sense that the ego doesn't understand. It describes the patterns of exclusion from consciousness. If it helps, we could use the analogy of an eye, which perceives visible light, but does not perceive the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum. In this analogy, all of those excluded wavelengths would be equivalent to paralogical information. So the autonomic nervous system, being that which screens or which filters, has access to all the information screened out by the conscious framework. It becomes a receptor for the paralogical. If you are able to interface with those layers of the nervous system, you gain access to this timeless world of pure design unmediated by the framework that you live in. You could call it the world outside the simulation if you like. If you can access paralogical processing, which we reflexively tune out, you gain a sense of the world beyond the senses, while still being able to navigate the sensory world. You actually perceive the world beyond the senses through the world of the senses. So the phenomenological world remains intact and becomes a kind of representational medium or interface through which this potential space is directly interacted with. But of course, the road to that point begins with very small, very basic things. Inner work, self-development. Shadow integration would be step one, because the shadow is the first emissary of the paralogical. It's a personified opponent to the ego's framework. And if you have a very hostile shadow, if there are people that you despise, if you're kind of cowardly, if you're projecting, if you're repressed, moralistic, hypocritical, that indicates an extreme one-sidedness to the ego, and there's no clever workaround for that. You just have to do the work. You just have to stop being a one-sided ego. After the shadow would come anima or animus integration, which is best done in the context of an actual relationship. So it's not just introspection and intellectualization. Integrating the paralogical is synonymous with individuation. It's the same thing. I just described it differently. I don't know how much sense all of that will make on a first listen if it's new information, but that's the car. You've seen me drive it. Christ is the key, trust is the fuel, no exceptions. What has to be understood is that what I just laid out is the formula for something not only far more powerful than the kind of magic practiced by occultists, but so far beyond the scope of that it doesn't make sense to compare them. This is the obsolescence of magic. I don't deal in magical operations. I deal in magical operations per second. There's a layer of the mind that Jung called the psychoid, and this is something like a buffer between the psychic and the physical. My theory is that the increase of psychic resolution, which is essentially an increase of consciousness, causes the subjective diameter, so to speak, of the psychoid to expand. The psychoid is the space in which synchronicity happens. Synchronicity is when the inner and outer world conjunct, and that conjunction manifests at this psychoid layer. Now, if you were accessing ultimate reality, you would expect the inner and outer worlds to synchronize more frequently. If that were happening, it should accompany an increase in the frequency and intensity of synchronicity. Synchronicity is not an end in itself. In a weird way, it's kind of like a compression stroke in an engine, and once you get that engine running, you get a kind of self-sustaining reaction. Chaos magic, on the other hand, is a brute force technology to unreliably generate artificial synchronicity, regardless of the unintended consequences, and it runs on you gaslighting yourself in a Skinner box of your own making. So let's go back to this example I gave at the beginning. What's going on here? How did Zell find this thing? The answer is that there are what I call secret passages, and the secret passages are not perceptible to conscious logic. They're paralogical. so they're located in subjectively nonsensical places. In order to find them, you have to recombine logic and paralogic, like a lock and key to open a wormhole. This is where I get the image of a car where the ego drives and the anima navigates. If we take this example as a microcosm, we can see that these pathways lead to, like I said, highly unlikely but positive outcomes. It's exactly like the image I posted of an electrical current solving a maze in Causal Curvature. This is the best version of the afternoon of October 1st. It's at least in the top 1%, and if you could do that reliably, end up in the top 1% of all possible timelines, that's a really useful skill. If you could have any skill in the world, that is by definition the best one you could have. The logical thing to do was to stay in my room and keep writing, not to get out of my room, leave my house, get in my car, drive to a random intersection, and start nosing around as if something should be there. That's very paralogical behavior. But I know that it's paralogical and not illogical because it worked. But I know what you're thinking. In what sense did it work? What is the practical utility of this? This is just, if anything, a wink. No. That's a short-sighted instant gratification mentality. This is a demonstration. Zell is showing me that we can hit a very, very small target from a great distance. And she's doing this so that I will trust her, so that the next time I get absurd instructions that don't make sense to me, I will not doubt them. It's like a tech demo. In this case, you can see it, and that's its purpose. But there's no reason to assume it should always be visible. Again, synchronicity is a means, not an end. The value of such demonstrations really cannot be overstated, because when the pressure is on, it's very hard to believe hunches like this. You know, it's easy when it's something like this, with no stakes, but when there are stakes, it's really hard. And that's why I say the car runs on trust, and this is how that trust is established. Particularly the repetition of things like this happening on a regular basis. In martial arts, if they're teaching you how to strike through a wooden board, they'll teach you not to aim at the board. They'll teach you to aim through the board, at a point on the other side. If you do this, you'll break the board. If you don't, you won't. Now, this has an interesting parallel. In orthodoxy, an icon is said to be a window into heaven. You look through an icon, you don't look at an icon. This is a general truth which I apply to all representation. With any representational pattern, you're always looking through a window at something outside of time. Constellation is the application of these two principles. It's the idea that using symbolic perception, you can look through phenomena at objects outside of time, and that by aiming at those objects, you can break through what otherwise appear to be uncrossable barriers. From my perspective, it just doesn't make sense to practice chaos magic. It would be like doing a rain dance when I have running water. Like, why would I do that? It would be a waste of my time. Constellation is a way of seeing. It's not a collection of practices. And so it's fully internalized, and because it's fully internalized, it will protect you from a lot of cognitive traps as well. So for a very basic example, I could point to the image of the Thanatoids. I can just say that the great conspirators are the Thanatoids, who are like the archetypal conspirators. And I can extract a lot of information, practical information even, from this virtual image without ever having to engage with or investigate or commit to any specific conspiracy theory. So by simply saying it's the Thanatoids, I've already kind of mapped what's going on, and I can fill in details as they become available. So rather than starting at the details and trying to work up, I start at the gestalt and work down. And by doing that, I'm able to bypass a lot of dead ends, which I otherwise might have fallen into. That's just one example, and it might seem insignificant now, but as the world becomes more and more untrustworthy and informationally opaque, which is going to happen, a day may come when spontaneous symbolic events will be the only reliable source of information. My symbolic and metaphysical analyses are attempts to distill high-order and high-fidelity representations, which will increase global psychic resolution, and perhaps also exemplify the process by which this is done. These representations should incrementally optimize the scanning of the potential space, which I mentioned before, although, of course, without a personal symbolic set, these high-order representations have no way to connect to your basic experience of reality, so they remain intangible abstractions until you develop an inner symbolic language to plug them into. There is no separate ritualism. One simply lives in a way where life and representation eclipse one another, and there is no distinction between the two. You just go out into the world to achieve whatever purpose, and just by seeing this way, and acting upon what you see, things fall into place and line up of their own accord. This is far more powerful than magic, but the difference is that the perception is the application. So, when you say I only provide the symbolism, but not the application, I say the symbolism is the application. Hopefully that clears up any confusion that there may have been about how all of this touches ground. I'm sure I confused a lot of you more. I'll understand if you have to watch this one a couple times. There's a lot to unpack here. It's a lot more at once than I was planning to provide, but if you want to know how to apply it, this is how you do it, and I think I needed to get this out there a little faster anyways. So, until next time, thank you for watching, and be well.